Epic battles are supposed to occur long ago and far away. But in city after city, an epic battle is going on right now. It's a battle about where you and your children will be allowed to live, where you will be allowed to work, and where and how you will be allowed to travel. It is a battle for your very lifestyle. It was started not so long ago by faraway, out-of-touch city planners and is spreading nationwide. In city after city, planners are imposing untested, experimental visions about the ideal city lifestyle on an unsuspecting public. Few people even know that an experiment is being done, or that they are the guinea pigs. This series explores these issues.
Rob suggested that maybe I should do some self-introduction, and I won't really bother much other than to say that I've been doing this commuting in America for 20 years or so, and as one of the great opera producers said to one of his singers, you'll keep doing it till you get it right, you know. I don't know how many more of these I have in me, so I think we'll probably call it a day with this one, but it has been a great privilege, really, to work on this, and I find it a subject of endless fascination. Maybe I'm just easily fascinated, I don't know. But I really do love the work. I love the collision of demography with geography and the interaction in our society between social, economic, and logistics and engineering and technology, all of it that goes to it. I have some material here that's based on Commuting in America 3, which you've probably seen or heard something about. It's out now, I guess, a couple of weeks, printed by the National Academies. And it's been a lot of fun talking to press, and as I mentioned in the discussion before, I've been very pleased at how bright the press has been, and how thoughtful, and how into the report. I mean, they actually have read it, and it's not like they're kind of waiting for me to kind of spoon feed them. They are engaged, so it's great to hear. I'm going to talk about that process, more about the process of creating Commuting in America, its data issues and some of its ramifications, and a lot of the material that goes into the book. I recognize that this is a smart bunch, and so I'm going to move quickly through the material, and you're allowed to stop me and slow me down, because people tend to say that I sometimes can go too fast through this stuff. But I think most of you are heavily familiar with a lot of this, so I feel comfortable in kind of moving through it. This is my reflex on our national goal today, which is making things get worse slower. Mary Peters, when she was Federal Highway Administrator, I said this was the motto of FHWA, and Mary hasn't forgiven me for that, and it's okay. I figured she went back to Arizona, so it didn't matter. Now she's secretary, so now I'm really in trouble. She's a great lady, and I really do love her dearly, and she probably will make me eat those words. But it does bear on my point. What I like to bring to this discussion is my goal here, and this is my description of my goal, is to reduce the effects of distance as an inhibiting force in our society's ability to realize its economic and social aspirations. And that brings, I hope, transportation into a broader context than getting into arguments about some of the smaller parts of it. This is a very critical part of it. And I think one of the things I like to emphasize in these discussions is that transportation, that America is a very transportation-oriented nation, very much focused in its whole social and economic being. I like to talk about the tyranny of distance, which is actually a phrase that was originally applied to Australia, which I think it applies to as well. But it's not a shock that it's a big country, but I think it is important to recognize that America has probably done a better job of addressing the challenge of distance than any nation in the world. And it has an immense impact on our ability to function as a nation. And as we go out into the future, competing in a more global world environment, I think it'll be even more important. Transportation basically about time and distance. I think that in recent years and out into the future, time will come to dominate. The pressures of time in a society where people are more affluent, where goods are more valuable, the pressures of time will come to dominate. As I was saying to a group earlier today, that a more affluent society next year will view the same transportation system more negatively because they bring a value of time that's greater to it. A shipper who has a more valuable product than he had last year will judge the system more harshly. And so I think we in the transportation profession are in effect dealing with a moving target, and it's one that's going to judge us more harshly over time. And so the automobile, the truck, I think is very frequently going to be the response. We want to talk about what technology is making the thing go. But in a high income world, high value world, where these things are true, the pressures of time will always be the dominant pressure. A little bit about our world today. These are some of the summary characteristics. I've kind of low-lighted globalization because I'm not going to talk about that. I am going to talk about some of these other things that are important factors. The keys here are, well, let me just go to the next slide. I think this is a shorter version of basically that. The demographic story. The Commuting in America series, kind of accidentally, I didn't start out with this in mind, but it really documents the history of the baby boom generation and its workforce years. And now that group is moving off stage, and we're entering a new phase, a new stage, and that's where we talked about the end of commuting. This new stage is going to be very different, I believe. The past stage has been immensely challenging, and I think many people don't recognize the wrenching forces that we've been subjected to in our transportation world and in our society. And a world in which, by and large, I think we've done rather well. We met an extraordinary set of challenges. Women joining the labor force in tremendous numbers, the baby boomers coming of working age, the proliferation of the automobile, on and on and on. And we came through it relatively well. A lot of that is behind us. The world is maybe a little bit easier to operate on. New challenges, different challenges. The big one will be, where are these workers going to come from? How do we replace the generation? A lot of things are going to be more stable. Licenses, vehicles, workers, population, migration, relatively stable. The changing forces, incomes, locations, where do people want to be? Immigrants, and what do they look like? Who are they? What are their skill levels? Where are they going to be? And the aging labor force and the aging population in general. So those are the panoply, I guess, the balance that I'm talking about between stable and change. This is a little bit of a statistical chart to give you some context of where we are. These are the census counts of the population up through 1990 to 2000. And all of a sudden, this was the census projection for 2000. In December of 2000, the census projection was for a population of 275, and then they published the decennial, and it came in at like 283, and they all of a sudden had found 7 or 8 million people. As if 7 or 8 million Mexicans had come across the border dying to be counted by the Bureau of the Census. And I think what happened is these people have been here a long time, and the census just got around to finding them. The census believes that too, because they then shifted back, and their new estimates don't really even recognize that dramatic growth that they saw in the decennial. And they've gone back to fundamentally this long-term projection that kind of looks like business as usual. So I would not be shocked to see the 2010 census be a big surprise again, and see 8 or 10 million people that we didn't know we had. If you look at the projections, you could do it with a straight edge. They spend a lot of money doing these projections, but if started out in 1950, add 25 million per decade, and you pretty much got it right. And this is how we have grown. This is how we're projected to grow. The traditional thing that they show is this chart, which is not too revealing. It's kind of slow with this red line. You see it declining, and that's the working age population, but it doesn't look so terrible. And the older population increasing, and that does look significant. The younger population stable. This is the kind of traditional view, but you have to recognize what's going on here, and it's really rather dramatic. The blue line is the percentage of, this is males. You can just multiply it by 2 pretty much. But this is the percentage of people, of men who are of working age. And this is what happens to it. It goes from 60% to 54% in basically 20 years. From 2000 to 2010, we added 20 million workers. 20 million people of working age. Over the next 2 decades, we'll add 12 million. So we're going to have this immense drop-off in the number of people of working age. In order to maintain our labor force, in order to keep going, we're going to have to get a whole lot of folks into the labor force, more than we ever have before. Get more women into the workforce even than we have. Try to hold on to older workers, men and women, longer. More immigrants population, engaging the rural population, which tends to be underemployed in this country, and bringing the rural populations to the metro areas to work. Some of you saw the article in the Oregonian today, and I mentioned that to them in that interview, and this really means, in many instances, people commuting long distances. These are rural populations, in many cases, who don't or can't afford urban housing, don't want to leave their rural populations, but as the jobs move out to the suburbs, it becomes realistic and competitive for them to consider commuting into the metro area. And you can think of it of inner city populations commuting out to those jobs and rural populations commuting in and competing somewhere in the middle. So it's going to be a very changing, strong environment. These are the workers that we added over the decades, and you can see it has dropped off. And so our problem in the future may be too few commuters rather than too many. I don't want to overstate it too much, but it is going to be an important task. This is a chart that we have talked about in a couple of cases this morning, and this basically says that commuting is a small and declining share of the action. And so people can say, why do you keep writing about it? It's still very important, and for some reasons we can identify, but I insist to you guys, especially those of you who are going to be working in the profession, that it is very important to keep this whole list in mind when you're addressing a question. Often we say we're going to talk about transportation, we immediately forget freight, and then we forget all the other passenger activity, and so we go to commuting, we get into an argument about transit versus highways, and think we're talking about transportation. And I really think that that's not a particularly productive way to spend time. And I would really argue that you need to focus on all of these things and recognize them as part of your planning process. I said in the book 10 years ago that there's no metropolitan agency, no state agency that can describe what's going on in their area statistically in all those 8 categories. And I'd be willing to bet on that. Talking a little bit about where commuting is, this is the share by day of commute, of percentage of all trip purposes. And as you can see, the peak is what, 19 point something percent earlier in the week, but typically 16, 17%, depending upon how you want to count. Declining in all of these different measures. This is person trips, vehicle trips, person miles, vehicle miles, all of them basically declining over time. Not because work travel is declining, but because everything else is growing so fast. Here you see the work trip roughly of the same. This is trips per capita, but you see that everything else is really booming, especially the family personal business stuff. So it's declining as a share of the total action. This is the key to our future. The red are the number of workers out of the total bar, which is workers and non-workers by age group. And as you see, you get out here to 55 to 64, very sharp break. And the whole question in a lot of our future will be, where's the red and the blue break here? How many of these people in the 65 to 74-year-old age group are you going to be able to keep in the labor force? And to what ramifications will that have in the society if you do? You're going to have many older people in the transit systems, in the highway systems, and that could have safety ramifications, could have other effects. There are already indications that we're seeing that happen, and I'll talk about that in a sec. This is a final piece, a little background here, something that I want to bring to your attention, that out into the future, as the population ages, VMT per capita declines, even though the growth, which is this is the red is the change, has been prodigious in the older age groups, they still have much lower levels of travel than the 35 to 54-year-old age groups. So in many respects, a lot of our world will be a more operable one that I think that we can address and engage in. One of the interesting trends that I've been around to see, this is 1980. This is all the metro areas over 1 million in the country, and this is their share of driving alone single occupant vehicle. This is Detroit up here with about 1980, about 75%, and that's New York, the only one down below 60%. Okay, 1990, and the average growth in driving alone is from 8 to 10 percentage points. And this is all areas over 1 million. And there's a couple that didn't grow quite as much, but by and large, nationally, the pattern was a substantial increase in driving alone. This is 2000, and yes, there's still an increase, but the increase is more on the order of 2%. So back in Commuting America 2, I argued that we were seeing some stabilization of driving alone, that is to say, the increase in driving alone. And the answer is yes, it is still growing, but it is more stable, and the growth rates are small relative to the past. And I think we have reached some kind of a level of saturation on that. In fact, in the West, for the first time, we saw some areas where there actually was a decline in driving alone, which was unheard of in the past. Decline in share percentages, not in absolute. Seattle was 1.5 percentage points. Portland here, I think, was like under 1 percentage point, but still, I mean, these things are not big numbers, but the fact that they happen at all is of interest. But almost all of it, the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Las Vegas. Very much, and I'd love to have some of you PhD students look into this, almost a kind of a regression toward the mean. The Western states that had traditionally very high levels of driving alone, very little transit and not carpooling, very little transit, were sliding towards some center in the eastern areas where the very high transit and lower driving alone were sliding in the other direction. And so the country, in some ways, is looking a little bit more homogeneous. On the other hand, we do have this variation now between areas of the country where the West has seen some growth and the rest of the country not. These are some special transit tabulations that were done by the Urban Data Committee at TRB, a committee dear to my heart. The census gave up describing central business districts probably 20 years ago. They found it really hard to do and to have any kind of a uniform definition of what a CBD looked like. And so the Urban Data Committee took on itself with metro planners the definition on an ad hoc basis in each metro area of a CBD. And I don't know if you guys wanted to play that game in Portland, how you might define that CBD, and we'll accept the fact that it's probably going to be arbitrary. Two people would probably do it differently, but still the notion of a CBD is a significant one that we've lost because the census had such definition problems. But anyway, this kind of illustrates the story. This is, if you look at transit, and this is share of metro work travel, and you can see Washington, D.C. 9%, down to Dallas at 1.8%, not a very big thing. But if you focus in on the central city, obviously this goes up. In Dallas, it doesn't go up by much to 2.6, but still New York jumps, and this is now the central city definition within the metro area. And then if you go further into the CBD, you see a very strong focus on downtown, 38% to downtown in DC. For those of you who know Washington, the downtown is basically where the TRB meeting is, the Hilton South, that area. New York, I think what I used here is there's a couple of CBD definitions, but I think this one is 42nd Street, Manhattan South to Wall Street.
Could you just clarify, this is percent of people who work in those locations using transit?
Yes. It's percent work trip by transit, yeah. And we also look at some of the corridors where transit is strong and get similar results. So very attractive results. One of the things the book looks at is 4 dichotomies that I call them, that I think are revealing, and I suggest them to you for you to look at when you're looking at stuff. The one is whether you're over or under 20 minutes in commute, whether you're in or out of a metro over 5 million, whether you're before or after 8 o'clock or over or under 55. The one thing I'll call attention to is we have now 12 metros in America over 5 million, which is a third of the population, 100 million people living in those 12 metros. And that's the focus of an awful lot of the action in American congestion and economic output. That's a third of the population. I have no idea what percent of the GDP it is, but it's a big, big chunk. I'm sure it's better than a third. These big metros are the economic engines of the nation. But I use these dichotomies occasionally, and I don't know how deep we'll get into it here, but they, I think, have their power to reveal. You probably all familiar with the average travel times. I won't spend a lot of time on it, other than to say that it grew, strangely enough. Even as the number of workers declined, it grew faster. And so, in some ways, I think you could argue that we're kind of running out of the capacity that the world bequeathed to us. Reporters love to talk about extreme commutes. I prefer to focus on the two things that I use is the percent of the population under 20 minutes and the percent of the population over 60, and looking at the tails of the distribution, which I think is much more sensible than looking at averages. Historically, America had more than half the population getting to work in 20 minutes, which is to say, in my view, you have nothing to complain about. If you're getting to work under 20 minutes, whatever mode it is, you're doing pretty well. But that is declining. It's now down to 47%. It's very strongly affected by metro area size. You're seeing this is, you probably have trouble seeing in the back. This is 5 million or more, and that's 50,000 down there. So this is metro size class, and you got more than 10%, 11, 12% of people over 60 minutes in the 5 million group, drops off very sharply, and the 20-minute thing has exactly the opposite effect as you would expect. Here again is an example of the 5 million effect. Carpooling, working at home, very stable with respect to city size. Transit, absolutely tremendously affected by scale. And you see, if you compare working at home to transit, you get to a stage where somewhere around 2.5 million in many metro areas, working at home is a bigger factor in commuting than is transit. And it's the work at home segment is the only factor, call it a mode, I guess, that has been growing continuously along with driving alone. It's an important force. It's now more important than walking to work. And I think out into the future, it'll be even more significant. Here again, you see transit share by metro area size. You already saw some piece of this, and this is stratified by central city and suburban. And you can see the very strong influence of scale, of metro size scale. I talked to the Women's Transportation Seminar this morning, and this was one of the things we talked about. Women comprise roughly 47% of the labor force. Early in the morning, it's a guy thing, very heavily oriented to males. You get up to 7:30, it begins to shift over, and in fact becomes majority female in this period. And then about 9:30, 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock, it starts to shift back again. A lot of reasons that we could discuss about this. I won't go into them, but it's an important difference in this eight before and after thing. That's one of the factors. This is another factor. Before 8, up until 8, it's about 92, 93% automobile-based in the nation. After 8 o'clock, walking, transit, bicycling begin to play. This is all of the non-auto modes, I guess is what you should know you're looking at here. And you begin to see it here, and then it, again, after 10, 11 o'clock, it drops back again. So there's a time factor here, which I had not observed before. I don't know, maybe somebody else has seen this and can explain it better than that, but this came as something of an interesting surprise to me. One of the important changes is this, the press gets very enamored with, is the sliding to the shoulders. A little bit hard to read this, so let me take you through it. Basically what this says is, here, from 5 to 6:30 a.m., the 14.7% of the workers were traveling in that time period, leaving home in that time period in 90, but they in the share of change, they had 25%. So we have an extreme shifts away from the so-called peak period, and it's increasingly important. And this is, I think, one of the real measures of the failure of the system when you start seeing people traveling. 11% of the growth is in people traveling before 5 a.m. Yes, ma'am?
What's WAH?
Oh, WA? Everybody knows WA. It's work at home. And you can see work at home was 3%, and it was 6% of the growth. It's a shorthand that one gets into with, sorry. The boomers, aging out. This immense slug of the boomers right on the verge of going into 65. There's a population 55 and above. Half of them are in this 55 to 59-year-old age group. Big, big factor. Are they going to shift out? Are they going to retire and go away? Or are they going to stay in the labor force? Mode changes significantly over 55. Here you see driving alone dropping off rather sharply. You can't see the carpool effect, so I'll blow that up a little bit. Did I miss it? Huh, I guess I did. I'm sorry, but carpooling does the same thing. It drops off. And these are the modes under carpooling and under driving alone, and you see dramatic increases in working at home. And some changes in walk, little bit of modification in transit, more trading back and forth between the transit modes. But this is the important and maybe critical factor in our future in terms of people working at home in the older age groups. As some people have pointed out to me, driven a lot by the new technologies, by our services economy, etc. The boomers aging out, one of the things in terms of their travel times, you see that both the youngers and the older folks tend to commute with shorter distances. It's the younger people in the middle working years that have the long commutes, and this is not a shock. As I was saying, the older people, in effect, can make trade-offs, can opt to live near work and pay the mortgage that it might cost. A younger person may not have that option, and so they're trading travel time for mortgage payments. Talking about the aging out, I say the shift has already begun. 11.2% of the workers, of the folks over 65 were workers in 90, now 12% in 2000. The 2005 data shows 12.7%, so we're already beginning to see the fact that this workforce is staying around. And as I say, it's a very positive thing, but on the other hand, it's got some real issues. If you take it out to 2020, even if you don't assume that share, even if you assume that share is going to remain constant, and I'm pretty sure it won't, you're going to have twice as many people commuting over 65 as we do now. So I think there's going to be a real important factor in our addressing that, whether it's in transit or in automobiles or whatever other mode it might be. We haven't talked much about immigrants. They are a key part of the working age groups, the 16 to 65, the people of potential work participation. Obviously, very few of them in the 65-year-old age group, a heavy portion of them in the young age groups. The immigrant component of modes is very, very variable. You can see here, this is the driving alone, and a very small share of driving alone, colossal shares of carpooling. 5 and 6 person carpools, 40% immigrant. And you can see throughout, this is kind of the immigrant signature, if you will, in these different modes, and you can kind of study it at leisure. Over time, this is immigrants who have been here 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, or over 20. And it starts out with very strong commitments to carpooling, dramatic, in fact, carpooling, transit use, even walking and bicycling, very strong bicycling, which surprised me. But over time, it transitions into something more typical of the overall population. Over time, carpooling, which is very powerful, as I mentioned, declines. And over time, transit use declines, bus and rail. Think about this, recognize the temporal nature of this, that each 5-year contingent has a replacement cohort that's coming in. There's a new group. And so it's not that you're going to see the changes in these modes. There's going to be replacement groups that are coming in with those characteristic modal signatures, I guess. The power of affluence in our society is not to be dismissed. Immense part of our issue set in the country is the fact that we are a very affluent society. And so a lot of the products that we deal in terms of congestion, et cetera, is a product of that affluence. Transportation spending rises in shares of income as incomes rises. As a percentage of income, transportation spending rises with income, except to the highest levels that you see there. Trips per household rises with income. I'm sure you've probably seen that. That's the median income where we are in the nation today. Portland is higher than that. Work trip lengths, I mean, this is a PhD thesis if ever I saw one. Work trip length increases with income, which almost belies some of the thoughts we might have, but presumably the high income people would be the ones who could optimize. But you have to realize in America, high income households, not typically the product of one person making a lot of money. High income households are high income households because they got a lot of people earning money. High income households, the highest quintile has 3 times as many workers as the lowest quintile. So it's an aggregate process, and that has immense ramifications for transportation. Because if you have 2 and 3 workers in a household, the approach to transportation and travel is very, very different. And the ability to, for instance, live near work when you have 2 workers, 3 workers, is really pretty tricky. Mode choice by income, as you would expect. At 25K, you see the first house, the first car come into play. By 40,000, you see the second car come into play nationally. The modes have income signatures, and you can play with this again. I just show it to you here. You take a look. This is the blue is the over 100,000. The highest income signature is in commuter rail and ferry boats. Don't know what they're doing on those ferry boats, but that's I guess if you ride ferries, you get to be rich. I want to talk about vehicles a little bit. Saturation. This is a long-term picture, 1910. Some people talk about being too oriented to the automobile as if it's a recent phenomenon. By the mid-30s, everybody in America could sit in an automobile. And it's a very strong phenomenon. We're seeing some stabilization of it. The shares by auto ownership, I think since 1980, have been relatively stable. Percent 0 vehicles, percent 1, percent 2. We've seen some blip in the 1 vehicle households as the immigrant populations gain auto ownership. One of the big changes, perhaps one of the most important, is this African American shift from 90 to 2000, from 31% down to 24% of African American households without vehicles. And this little thing here is 2005 data, new survey, American Community Survey, so I wouldn't exactly argue how comparable it is, but the ACS puts you down around 21%. And all of the other modes, the Hispanic shift down, and the non-Hispanic white shifts down. So this is up through 2005. The 2006 with the high gas prices, I'm sure put a crimp in that. I don't know how it worked out. I don't need that one. This again is the foreign-born ownership of those that arrived in the last 5 years, very high levels of zero-car ownership that transition down over time, again to be replaced by new cohorts. A little bit about geography. This is a chart that many have seen in the past, the shift towards suburbanization, and obviously it began in this century and has been one of the dominant forces in our geography. This is where we're going, and I guess we're coming your way. The remarkable point is that Texas, Florida, and California each get 15% of future growth, according to the census. And all of the Midwest and Northeast get 12%. And this is out from 2000 to 2030. So there's going to be an immense focus in the West, in the South, and in those Caltexfula, those 3 states that have been absorbing roughly half the population growth. So it's going to be dramatic shifts which are going to change the nature of many aspects of the society in terms of our focus on equity and certain aspects of the society. There's going to be some real kicks. And the focus in the future, I think, is going to be on these big metros. The short version of this is simply, we had 53 areas over a million in 2005, probably be 60 by 2020. That obviously will continue, and as I mentioned to you before, 12 areas with more than 5 million, a third of the nation's population. And this is going to be one of the major economic engines in our future. I won't go into the statistics here, but it's a mess. The census has really hurt us with their definitions and redefinitions of what metro is, what central cities are. And so when you approach this, you can get into all kinds of trouble because of the changing definitions if you try to compare one period to another. They do some very special tabulations for me in this thing that tries to null out some of these suburban confusion in the definitions. One of the things I focused on is the percent of workers leaving their home county to work. And it has been, again, a dramatic increase. This is a measure that I use as one of the changes, along with early start times and long distance commutes. These three things, I think, kind of go together. But this is dramatic across the entire country. This is Georgia. This is 1990. The yellow are counties shifting more than 25% of their workers out of the county every day to work. And this is 2000, and you can see how, go back and look at that. That's that, that's that. And that's the country. All the red counties are counties shipping more than 25% of their workers out. Obviously, big counties, you know, going to distort it. You can see up around Portland up there what happens. My neck of the woods, Virginia, Maryland, are the center. There's only 2 counties in the whole state of Virginia that don't ship 25% of their workers out. And we can talk a lot about what's causing that and what's going on. But this is an immensely important force out into the future. This kind of blows it up so you can get a little closer view. In terms of the flows, 64% of the growth was in suburb to suburb flows. 14% was in the traditional suburb to central city. But 19% was center city outbound. So we had much greater growth outbound than inbound. And the central city to central city was only 3% of the growth. And this is, I think, an important aspect of where we are for the future. I call it the donut metro. We got 7.5 million people commuting out to the suburbs and 7.5 million commuting in from exurbs, from rural populations. The 2 states with the greatest travel time increases were West Virginia and New Hampshire. It wasn't the congestion in Wheeling. It was people in West Virginia commuting to the Washington metropolitan area, commuting to the Pittsburgh metropolitan area, and to the metro areas in Ohio. And this is, I think, in many respects, the nature of our future. I don't need to show you that. And this is what the flow picture looks like, and this is just to emphasize the fact that one of the keys now is intermetropolitan flows. People in the suburbs of one metro area working in the suburbs of another metro area. Even central city to central city flows. There's an expansion here, whether it's an opening up of job opportunity or whatever it is, people are taking advantage of these very long potential commutes. I just want to emphasize the fact that the 2 keys in transportation are time and cost, and those are the things that we're worst at measuring, whether it's in the freight side or the passenger side. We are very, very bad at all of this. Our travel time information, our cost information, our purchased information, our transit services information, all keyed to this things that are critical, and yet we don't know how we're doing it and how well we're doing. I mentioned my keys on travel time. And you can see again this pattern of the 20-minute commute, significant in West. It's basically a Midwestern phenomenon where they're still above 20 minutes, and the Northeast actually bends the whole country. New York can actually distort the entire national picture. I want to close with a reference here to a couple of questions. This is the questions raised in Commuting in America 2. These are the questions that I raised 10 years ago, and I thought that by now I'd have the answer to them, and I have to say that there's not one of these questions that has been answered. They have answers that'll persist out in the future. It's going to be another 10, maybe another 20 years before we know whether job-worker balance matters much, whether minorities will be very different or become typical. Will the technological fixes actually work? Will immigration trends shift towards the mainstream? All of these things are questions that are still open questions for us, and I've added a few more, and these are the ones I would leave you with. Number one, who and where will the workers be in a society where workers and skilled workers will be at a premium, and employers will go wherever those workers want to be, wherever those workers would like to be a mountaintop in Colorado, downtown Portland, wherever it is. It will be amenities-based in many respects. People going where they'd like to be. When I left New York, I grew up as a transportation planner. My first job was working for Doug Carroll at Tri-State in New York. And I said, I'm an urban planner. Urban planners can plan urbs anywhere. And as long as I can do it anywhere, I might as well do it in a nice place, right? And I think that that's kind of typical of the services industry, which says, as long as I'm doing this, I might as well do it in a nice place. And employers in the future will have to recognize that. They'll have to be more responsible, more flexible, more, in order to gain those skilled workers. They're going to be reacting very strongly to that. And the question here still, will the value of time still be the driver? I think it will. But obviously the price of gasoline changes that calculus. And finally, my question I'd like to leave you, will the value of mobility be recognized? I think we're a society that, kind of like with running water, you don't really much care about it until it stops. Maybe mobility is one of those things that we tend to take for granted until it stops. So at that, I'll leave you. Usually, I say that commuting in America is available in gas stations, 7-Elevens all over America, but these days it's not. It's only available at the TRB, and so you have to go find it there. And I don't know, maybe somebody's going to assign it to you in a class to look at it. But anyway, thank you very much, and let's talk about it and maybe have some questions. If you scratch the surface, carpool riders look an awful lot like transit users. And there's a tendency to trade back and forth. You improve carpooling, people slide from transit into carpooling. Transit gets better and carpoolers leave. And so what has happened is that we haven't so much had people shift to driving alone. The number of people moving by automobile doesn't change as much as the number of vehicles those people are in. And so there's been a sliding from carpooling into single occupant. Some of the people going, and so a lot of that trade-off. So one of the things I use, for instance, is the share of carpooling plus transit. And yeah, as a measure of merit. And if you look at the number of 20%, what metro areas have 20% of their people in carpool plus transit? And the answer is 3, 4, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, end of story. Interesting, Boston, 17, 18%, Houston, 17, 18%, totally different. Houston, 15% carpool, 2 or 3% transit. Boston, 15% transit, 2 or 3, So you get that very strong mix. I would say that without getting into the economic, the scale of auto ownership, I would say that the mobility that the automobile provides to the society is immensely powerful in terms of total productivity. One of the things that the French have done lately is looked at access to job opportunity. And for every 10% increase you get in the number of jobs that you can reach, or the number of employees you can reach of your employer, you get a tremendous new boost in productivity. And I think this is going to be a factor that's going to play out in our future. It'll be immensely important to have these large metro areas with the ability to access 100,000 potential employees for high-skilled operations. You're going to need that immense labor force market shed to feed these capabilities. Freight, I am very pleased to have seen in the last less than 10 years an increasing emphasis and recognition of the importance of freight. It has an immense leavening power. It forces reality home on us, which I think is just an immensely important aspect. Going back to the previous question about economic productivity, in Baltimore, let me just contrast Baltimore and Washington. Our total output in Washington is paper and garbage. sometimes interchangeable. There's almost nothing in the way of productive output, manufacturing output. There's distribution of foodstuffs and stuff like that in Washington. And so we sort of can neglect thinking about freight with some degree of impunity. We impose costs on the freight delivery system, the FedEx guy, the UPS guy, the guy who's bringing the foodstuffs to the store, et cetera. But those costs are hidden. Up the road is Baltimore, and they have a port. And they get into an argument about transit versus highways, and they think that that's all there is to transportation. And then some guy says, I got a ship coming in tomorrow with 3,000 containers. What would you like me to do with it? And I think that really forces people to focus their minds. Those are 3,000 real containers that are going to have to go somewhere. They're going to have to go through the city streets. If that's the way you want to do it, you can put them in a tunnel and go under the streets. But you do have to address the fact that, like Long Beach, holy smoke, those ships keep coming in. They keep bringing, and they're getting bigger. And so I think it is instructive for transportation that freight forces us to kind of recognize the economic scale and the stuff that matters. And of course, the people in Texas have learned that from NAFTA, big time. I made up a mythical community called Fairfax County, Virginia, and talked about it and addressed the job worker balance in Fairfax County. And let me see if I can reconstruct. 1980, it was probably 6 jobs for every worker. I'm sorry, it was 6.6 jobs for every worker. In 90, it was 0.8. And now, in 2000, we have perfection. It's 1. And it's been disastrous. The other thing that you have to look at is what % of the people in the county fill those jobs. And so what I talk about is kind of a repository sense of, this is the kind of the perfect relationship. What is the real relationship? Right next to it is the Planner's Delight, Arlington County, which everybody loves. And they say, gee, we ought to have a jobs housing balance like Arlington. It happens to be 1.3 jobs per worker. So everybody in America should have 1.3 jobs per worker, which doesn't seem to, so we have a lot of Canadians coming every day. Anyway, the point is that in Arlington, their tendency to live and work in the same county is much less than Fairfax. They have a much poorer skills relationship between their workers and their jobs. And so that means they have to export a lot more people every day and import a lot more people every day. Kind of looks like this. This is PG County, this is Montgomery County, and this is Virginia. And the people in PG go to Montgomery, the people in Montgomery go to Virginia. I mean, you have this around the Beltway this way and then back around the other way. And so Virginia is importing colossal numbers of people every day to fill the fact that they don't quite have all those people live and work in the same place. And I would argue, by the way, and this is a place where you can get into all kinds of fistfights, that if in fact everybody did live and work in the same place, in the same county, let's say we use that as the spatial measure, what have you got? If you've got 20 counties that comprise the metropolitan area, and everybody lives and works in their own county, you've got 25 little hamlets that happen to be adjacent. The thing that matters is that when I'm here, I have access in a 50-mile radius to 100,000, 200,000 workers. That's the powerful thing. The fact that everybody lives outside the factory gate, that happened 100 years ago, and it's not very important. So there are too many factors. I was saying coming over here that I worked in China, where they owned the factories, they owned the housing, and they owned the workers, and they assigned everybody, and they still couldn't get it right. Tim Lomax and I have worked in a number of states, and a lot of them now are increasingly upset about congestion and very sensitive to the economic losses. In Austin, Dell Computer told the governor and the mayor that they were moving their next facility out and going somewhere else. because of congestion, and boy, did that focus people's attention on the subject. And got a lot of attention. Tim and I used a number of, the TTI index that he uses, which is basically the ratio of peak to off-peak travel time. And we started out with a number of 1.15, in effect a 15% penalty for the peak hour. And we went out to the MPOs and tested that and had them tested in their network models. And they came back with a number that was more like 1.18 to 1.20, which was getting rid of everything worse than level of service D, roughly. Tim and I went to Georgia, same thing. The governor, very upset about congestion. Atlanta, of course, one of the worst in the country in terms of growth and congestion. And we proposed something like this, and what the MPO ARC came out with was more of a number like 1.35, mostly because they thought that that's what they could achieve. We kept arguing that economically it was more sensible to be back here. And Texas was saying, the governor in Texas was saying, tell me what it takes to make Texas a world-class competitive city that I can compete with other cities in the United States, world-class state, with cities that can compete with other cities and with the world, that we're going to be as good as and that was the number we came at. In Georgia, the focus was much more, boy, this is tough. This is hard. It's expensive. And it is. Of course it is. But these numbers are relative to where they're going. All of these areas are up in the 145 to 155, and they're all going to 1.75, And so to get it back, a range back to 135 is prodigious. I agree. One should be able to calculate the accessibility impacts and the cost impacts. We're not very good at that. The national models that we work with for reauthorization tend to show that there are colossal benefits to reducing congestion and delay, thousands of hours of delay per $1 million would be that's the metric that I would use